All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Seth Foreman, the host of today's webinar and CEO at Socialsuite. Socialsuite and our partners have spent countless hours breaking down the comprehensive EU CSRD to help our customers understand and do our best to simplify this complex regulation. Today, we will uncover some of the potential pitfalls you need to know and avoid any major costly missteps. All right, so let me go on to the next slide here. Now, for those unfamiliar with Socialsuite, for the last 10 years, we've helped hundreds of companies get started and progress their sustainability journey through our simple and cost-effective materiality management solutions. Companies like Directive, Cooper Companies, and Double Verify trust the Socialsuite team to support their journeys. And moving on. Now, we produce generally about once a month. We have different types of webinars that we're producing on all different types of sustainability and ESG topics. What we do recommend, please go onto our website. You could go into our webinar section, which you could find in the nav bar, and you'll check out all these different webinars that you can see on demand and to continue to further your education on these complex topics. And without further ado, I do want to go through some housekeeping items. Now, the content of today's webinar is going to last about 30 minutes, and then we'll hold the Q&A session. If you have any questions and comments as we go through the content, feel free to add them into the chat box right on the right. Our presenters, potentially in real time, will pause the presentation to answer them, or we'll get to it at Q&A. But we do want to make this as interactive as possible. Now, we are going to record today's webinar, and we will distribute it pretty soon after we conclude today's webinar. So look out for that. That'll come in your email. And finally, we are going to run a quick poll that Dr. Tim is going to run around your familiarity with the CSRD double materiality process. So let's introduce our presenters. Dr. Tim, if you want to introduce yourself to the audience.
Excellent, thanks, Seth, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Socialsuite, and I do a lot of work with companies that are planning to or going through that process of doing their first, mostly speaking at the moment, double materiality assessment that aligns with that European Union's corporate sustainability reporting directive. And there's a lot of insights to share, so I'm quite excited to have Jeff here today to talk to me about that.
And over to you, Jeff. You want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here, Seth and Tim. Excited to talk about this topic. So I am the Managing Director of Sustainability and Climate at a firm called Azuri. Azuri's a boutique specialized sustainability consulting firm, and we work with Fortune 500 to mid-cap companies across their sustainability journey, everything from sustainability strategies to double materiality assessments, climate risk assessments, to reporting, disclosing externally in accordance with some of the both regulatory and sustainability standards and frameworks there. Excited to be here today.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to come off the stage here. Tim, Dr. Tim, and Jeff will take it away from here. I'll come back for Q&A. So I'll leave it over to you guys. Good luck.
Excellent, thanks, Seth. So I've just shared on the right-hand side on the polls, just shared a little poll. We're always really interested to know where people are in their thinking and in their learning around just CSRD-DMA. So the CSRD-DMA is that double materiality assessment we're talking about today. So if you look in the poll there, how familiar are you with that process? Maybe you've never done one, and you're really kind of in that process now of learning and absorbing a lot of content from webinars and the like. Maybe if you're planning, you're really in that planning phase, or in the middle of doing your first. That's kind of really realistic as well. We see a lot of companies that are trying to figure it out as they go. But also, there's a number of companies now that have done their first CSRD reports, have gone through that DMA process. So I see that completed at least one. We don't have anyone here that's done that now. We do have a few people that have never done it or are planning. So that's good to know. So indeed, it will be quite educational. And what we'll be focusing on today, there's a lot to go through in that sense, but we really want to focus today on what are the pitfalls? So what are those common areas? Looking at the first reports that are out there, the first companies have gone through this, what practitioners are figuring out, what are the areas where you can quite easily go wrong? And what does that look like? And how, of course, can you then, prevent that by using some best practices and just being aware of that? So the webinar consists of 3 parts. The first part is really briefly, I'll do a really quick kind of intro to double materiality. How does that fit into the CSRD kind of reporting requirements? So really to set the scene. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but it's always useful to have a clear view of, what are the expectations. The core then will be about the pitfalls and how to avoid them. And after that, Jeff and I will share a list of some best practices, some things that we've seen that really work and help you avoid some of those pitfalls, but also really get through that CSRD process in an efficient way. So from there, the first part really quickly is materiality. Most people know by now what materiality is, but it's always still good to really kind of flag that briefly. What it really means is it's a process there of defining the most significant sustainability issues that impact your company and stakeholders. So thinking about that, that's a very high level definition, and it's useful to give that a little bit more color around that. What we generally see is that it's been approached from 2 perspectives, from the impact perspective or from the financial perspective, which in this slide here you see as impact materiality and financial materiality. And if we use both perspectives, that is what we call double materiality, and that is becoming a lot more common. With impact materiality, we're really looking at what are the companies or organizations' impacts it's having on the outside world, so on society and the environment. So what are your both positive and negative impacts on the world? On the flip side then, with financial materiality, we're thinking about, well, how is the world, what type of sustainability related risks and opportunities is it posing to your company's financial bottom line? So the financial performance, how is that affected by any sustainability related risks and opportunities? Traditionally, companies would look at one or the other perspective, but today it's really a more holistic view where we look at both perspectives. So that's a quick intro. Where we get now then is that actually CSRD. And I think, Jeff, here, this is maybe a good point as well to bring you in. This looks pretty overwhelming and complex for a lot of people, which is on the one hand, yes, it's great if we can simplify it and take some shortcuts, but at the same time, this is just the reality of what CSRD is asking of us. And even this is still at a pretty high level there. What are your thoughts at the moment, Jeff, around where companies are, where the world is at with CSRD and the role in all this of double materiality?
Thanks, Tim. Great question. There's really a wide range of statuses of companies in terms of where they are along their CSRD journey. And that's dependent both on the one hand of their pre-existing sustainability maturity, the size of the company, also what are going to be their reporting deadlines there. And we're also seeing companies that are not subject to CSRD, but are an important supplier in a company's value chain here that is subject to CSRD. And they're already having discussions with their customers about the information that they need to provide in order to help those companies that are subject to CSRD comply with their obligations under both the double materiality assessment, but also the data that needs to be disclosed here. And so you'll see that in this diagram that we have here. So on the left-hand side, just to break it down, is kind of some existing work that you might have done or something that you can do to prepare before your DMA. And that's looking at, do you have any sustainability initiatives in place? Have you previously done a materiality assessment, whether it just be financial materiality, to comply with SASB, IFRS, or have you done a materiality assessment in accordance with GRI's standards, that's the Global Reporting Initiative standards, voluntary standards? What do you have in terms of your ERM, your enterprise resource management? Have you mapped your value chain? Do you have that information? How deep down the supply chain do you go when you look at that value chain mapping? This second box here really looks at is what's required of the double materiality assessment. You've talked about some of the key elements there earlier. I'll dive in just a little bit here, but some of those things that we're looking for is going to be a really participatory process with both your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders. There's going to be a high-level risk assessment at the very least that's looking at some of both your financial risk and your impact risk across your value chain there by country, by site, possibly by business unit, by product. That's going to help work to identify some of your more material topics, subtopics, and subtopics. And then throughout that engagement process that you're going to have with both external experts, subject matter experts, both on topics, but also on your business and your geography, and internally with different parts of your business, everything from finance to procurement. Those areas are going to be defined throughout that stakeholder engagement process. And through that, they'll seek to identify what we call impacts, risk, and opportunities. But in order to identify those risks, impacts, and opportunities, we often refer to those IROs. You first have to determine what dependencies do you have, both on nature, natural capital, human capital throughout your value chain. And that will help you understand and identify what those IROs, those impacts, risks, and opportunities will be. And companies can look to existing sector standards, which are out there with the GRI, with IFRS, SASB. And also there's going to be assurance element in there. So both your double materiality assessment needs to be the process as well as the outcomes need to be assured. So we'll talk a little bit more about assurance. As we move further right along the diagram here, you'll see disclosure requirements and data collection. Once you've identified those impacts, risk, and opportunities, then there are requirements for disclosure, both in terms of how you're managing those IROs, metrics related to those IROs. People are very familiar with greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Also, what policies do you have in place? What actions do you have in place? What targets have you set, to achieve that? And how is your business really going to be impacted, by these different risks and opportunities, and how resilient is your business strategy as well as your model there? So these are things they're going to be looking at here. One thing to note in this area is that the CSRD is not a behavioral focused legislation. It's more of a disclosure focus. So if you don't have things and elements in place, you don't necessarily have to disclose all of those metrics. And it's very focused around materiality. Materiality is really the starting point to drive these disclosures, identify these disclosures. And then if we look to the right-hand side here, if you are subject to CSRD, these need to be disclosed in your annual report, your management report, and specifically within the sustainability statement. They are requiring XBRL digital tagging here. That's going to be new for a lot of companies. There's also going to be limited assurance initially required of that reporting as well. But if you look in the bottom left-hand corner here in the yellow box, there is transitional relief, safe harbors, if you will, from the 1st to 3 years for a number of different elements related both to the value chain here, comparative information in the first year, meaning that you could report on information that's specific to your company for that year, not necessarily going back other years if you don't have that information. And some disclosures, particularly many in the social side, you can have transitional relief for the first 1 to 3 years on those. So a lot of options. I know that sounds a lot, and I'll pause there. I'm sure we'll have many questions about this later.
Thanks, Jeff. Indeed, this is a very comprehensive overview, and there's a lot happening here. I think the summary is that under the reporting, so a bit more on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a lot you could potentially report on. But the key here is to work out what is really relevant. So where are you really having impacts, or what are the risks and opportunities you are facing as a company? That's what we need to work out, because that's what we need to report on. So that's why that double materiality assessment on the left and that blue box is so important. Without that, we're basically kind of not sure what we should be reporting on, and doing everything is way too overwhelming for everyone. So it's about finding that focus on what is significant. So what we've done is that double materiality assessment, there are quite a few components there. So we kind of simplified that a little bit in the steps you go through when you do a double materiality assessment. And today, when we're talking about the pitfalls, we've identified a couple of key areas where we're going to be talking about some of those pitfalls there. They can be anywhere, that's for sure, but the ones that we really want to flag, where we really have kind of real world experience in terms of what we've seen and who we've worked with, they kind of generally sit more in these areas here. So with that short introduction kind of around double materiality and CSRD out of the way, we're going to look at 4 key areas. So the first one is about the value chain. And Jeff, you already just flagged that now, is that it's really important to look in that value chain and identify your critical dependencies on nature, on social, on human capital. So it's really important that you think about that, but also really important that you really understand what the value chain actually is. And we still find that a lot of companies think about that in different terms. So working on that concept of what is your value chain, what does that look like for your organization? Maybe you have multiple ones, maybe you have a very simple one and you're a smaller business. But we see most organizations, in particular the first one that transition into CSRD, are relatively complex. They have a lot going on, and not just only in their own operations. You really need to take into account what is happening upstream, so your whole supply chain, but also the end of life of products and services. What is happening downstream when you kind of move out of that? So in that full value chain, you really need to start thinking about all your business activities. What are all the things that I'm doing or that my suppliers are doing effectively? They're all related to you. And that's when you need to think about those dependencies and your activities, and need to think about what are potentially some of those impact risks and opportunity associated with that. But if you don't understand your value chain, it becomes quite hard. Doing that exercise, again, might sound pretty kind of daunting. Jeff, what have you seen in practice? How do companies deal with this value chain exercise? Are they generally kind of, quite aware of that? Is there a lot of existing information already in the business? It's just a matter of pulling the right heads together and it's there? Or, how do people deal with that? Are you still on mute, Jeff?
Apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Great question. So over this past year, I've had the opportunity to review quite a few DMAs, supposedly CSRD compliant DMAs from a wide range of companies and also financial institutions. And we're seeing many different approaches and a wide variety of quality and depth in there. A lot to the point that I don't feel they would actually be CSRD compliant. They're missing some of the key critical components that are outlined in the legislation there. Some are also misusing, I think, the transitional relief, or have a misunderstanding of what's allowed with that transitional relief. So, for example, when we talk about the full value chain, we're talking about the full life cycle of products, services as well. Everything from extraction here for some products to not just your direct customers, but also end users. And then how, if you're producing a product, what's the end of life cycle and how is that being disposed of? So looking across the full spectrum there, oftentimes we're seeing not enough time and resources being dedicated to going further into the supply chain. Most companies will see they'll start engaging at least some of the select suppliers, but they won't go further throughout the value chain. And that's where a lot of those really material IROs are going to be identified here. Additionally, with customers, some haven't engaged customers at all, sadly, but those that have engaged customers, they haven't gone to end users. So they're cutting short the value chain on both sides. Now, additionally, when we're looking at trying to identify those IROs, this is where you need to leverage, experts. So if you have operations in North America, but your supply chain extends into Asia, and you don't have experts with experience in Asia, within that industry, within Asia, within that topic where you're looking to understand the impacts on biodiversity, ecosystem services, that's been an issue. Another area which we'll get more into is also engaging affected communities. It's difficult for many companies. They're not used to engaging affected communities here. And so trying to find proxies such as NGOs, community organizations that you can engage with throughout the value chain there. I'd also like to give a point on the transitional relief here. So there is transitional relief for 3 years in that you don't have to engage everyone in your value chain there. But it does require you to, if you take that relief, to still conduct your value chain mapping using existing internal data here and publicly available data. So it might be the case that some of your tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers publish CDP reports here, which have a lot of impacts, risk, and opportunities, at least on the environment side there, or they publish their own sustainability report, or you know where their offices, their operations are, what countries they're in, and through a high-level risk assessment, you'd be able to identify, you know, is this a potential geographic or industry where there could be high human rights risk? So you could, even though you're claiming the transitional relief, there's many things you can do to try to identify those IROs throughout your value chain with just publicly available information and internal resources.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so I think, yeah, there's a few kind of ways we've seen companies deal with this. And yeah, there are definitely companies that have made an effort around value chain, but sometimes don't fully kind of scope it out correctly. So they don't go far enough on both the supply and the downstream as well. I have seen companies that had no consideration of value chain at all. And sometimes it's just like our core business activities are, and they focus on their own operations. They name a few of the key things they do, and that's the end of it. That's definitely kind of not compliant. But also, I think what I've seen is that even if companies go relatively pretty broad through that value chain, the way that they kind of consider them, what are my key dependencies and what are my key business activities, the way they capture that is pretty shallow in a way. So they don't really kind of give you a lot of information. They just say, oh, we're sourcing raw resources from Asia. That is not specific enough. We really need to know, what are those resources? Where is it really coming from? Are you taking it yourself out of the ground? Is someone else extracting it? Who's doing that? What is the country and what is the site? And that's really, really important as well to understand that, because even within a country, a different site could have very different impacts on the environment or the local communities living there. So it's really about being specific about what is the activity, what industry or sector is it related to, what is the location, the site, who's the actor that's involved there. So about being specific about all those components in your value chain, you're going to make it a lot easier a bit later on when you're going to think about those impact, risks, and opportunities. It's really useful to really take time and effort to do this right. Now, we do see companies that build this year over year, take that transitional relief. They say, we're going to do the first year, at least get a somewhat decent mapping out. And we recognize that it's not perfect, but we are putting systems and processes in place to be better next year and build upon that. So really kind of take that into account. I think value chain and identifying those dependencies and business activities are really a crucial first step to make sure that everything that follows is actually much better informed.
Yeah, and just to make one other point right here, I know we're short on time, but the more you invest up front in your DMA, the more money and time you will save later when it comes down to conducting essentially a later stage materiality assessment for disclosing information. So you've already identified the topics, subtopics, subtopics, and those IROs and where they're located throughout the value chain in the DMA. But when you get later in the process and you need to decide, okay, well, which information and at what aggregation or disaggregated level do I need to report that? For example, if you have one operational site in your value chain, which is extremely high risk for modern slavery issues that we have there, or withdrawing from high water stressed aquifers and communities, and that's not the case in the rest of your company or operations, you're going to want to be able to highlight that specific piece of information because it is material in and of itself.
And that's an excellent point. We'll have that in our best practices at the end as well. But think about this double materiality assessment. If you do this really well, and in particular the first time, it's hard yards, it's hard work, it's time and effort. The better you do this, the easier it is the next year. And yes, you can build upon that. If you don't do a lot of things correctly now, you'll have to redo. And we've seen companies that really kind of misinterpreted some components or left a lot of it out in terms of a shortcut, and they really have to start for certain areas from scratch in the second year. So the better you do this now, the easier it is the subsequent years. So we spoke already about dependencies and IROs. So again, IROs, impacts, risk, opportunities. So those are those that impact materiality and the financial materiality. We're really trying to work that out across that full value chain. So that's the key there, that we really need to understand that. What else is really important about this? And one of the things is what we often hear is that there's a bit of an order there between, you have the IROs, but you also have there's a critical dependency. And if we read the CSRD, generally they say, once you look through your value chain, start thinking about those critical dependencies you have, start identifying the impacts, and then with the impacts, identify any associated risks and opportunities. And after that, think about are there any separate risks and opportunities that are not directly related to an impact. So that's kind of a reading through the CSRD. What are your thoughts on that, Jeff? And how hard is it to do that? And how well are companies dealing with that process?
It's really tough. It is. It requires a lot of information. And companies, that are more mature and have been working on this side, particularly, utilizing GRI and trying to conduct impact-focused materiality assessments throughout their value chain. You've been working on this for years to look at the individual sites, look at the IROs. So for a company coming in that hasn't done a materiality assessment before, it can be very overwhelming. It can be challenging. It takes a while to really develop those relationships with your suppliers, particularly, and work through different tiers of suppliers to gather that information. Other companies that are using trying to pilot the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, at least from the environment side, they've had experience using the LEAP approach there to identify, assess some of those locations. What I see that's really missing, which is a requirement of CSRD here, is companies should really look to the interdependencies between your impact IROs or topics here and your financially material topics as well, because there's what we call in the industry dynamic materiality as well. So some items that aren't material at all, IROs or topics, could very quickly become material the next year, even in a few months. And some items, often items we see where there are those dependencies and we do identify those negative impacts on the environment or a society with changes in regulation or with changes in customer preference or incidents, those can also quickly become financially material impact or risk as well. And so it's really critical that even though you may not deem it initially financially material, you should still monitor these types of risk and understand them so you can more quickly identify the dynamism between those financial and material impacts that you have there. And that's largely been missing in most of the DMAs that I've seen. Also doing this helps you out because eventually after the relief period is up, you will have to monetize a lot of the effects of both climate and nature-related risk on your company. So this puts you in a good position once that relief is up to start quantifying those.
So there's a really interesting point here, and I think that's what a lot of companies also don't realize yet, is those IROs that we're trying to map and capture here. If you really think about it, it's really an ongoing process of IRO management, so to say. So it should not be seen as a quick sprint in which let's spend a few weeks to capture everything, put it in a spreadsheet, and then never look at it again. This is really, it can become quite quickly material. This is something that if we identify the IROs, we see companies now, the first companies that have done it, mostly in Europe, their long list of IROs, right? They just go through that value chain and identify all those impact risks and opportunities. They go into the hundreds. That's a very long list of all these potential IROs that they've captured. A lot of them will not be material. So when they actually review each IRO and start scoring them and thinking about them, a lot of them are not material. But you have that long list now. And you want to basically not just only manage your material IROs, you want to monitor all the other IROs. So really have a process in place in which you think about that and update that and refresh that and think about that periodically to make sure that you really understand which things are becoming material. So it's really important there. What we've seen as well is that maybe briefly on risk assessment there, like we spoke of that when we had that nice diagram to just kind of look at. A lot of companies that we've seen come to the game that are really brand new to this might have never done materiality. The moment you say the word risk with impact, risk, and opportunity, they're like, oh, we know our risks. We have an ERM and we have a risk register, so we're good to go. And which is great on the one hand, but at the same time, there's a lot more required. A lot of the, let's call them conventional, more kind of, from the finance section, they have their kind of corporate risk register. That's a good starting point. There's some interesting things in there, but there's more required there. So it's really important as well to think about what else do we need to do, and how can we make sure that our more kind of sustainability related risk assessments are actually aligned and feed into our conventional ERM and our corporate risk register, and how do those two systems talk to each other? Jeff, what are your thoughts on some of the more specific risk assessments that companies might have already done or could be doing, and what's the right time to do it? So we're thinking about, climate risk assessment or nature, or looking at human rights.
Great question. Often what I find when I work with companies on just not even double materiality assessments, but materiality assessments, and perhaps they wanted to historically report, alongside the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD disclosures, there's a key component of integrating those risk and opportunities into your ERM, your enterprise risk management planning system there. And when you do a DMA and you've done a high level risk assessment, you've identified maybe what those IROs are, you need to look at not only where they are on the value chain, but also the time horizon of that. So are we looking at it? Is this a short, medium, long-term risk or opportunity? It may not be material in the short term, but it may be material in the medium term. And in order to do kind of that horizon scanning and planning, often what companies will be required to do and will undertake is looking at that climate risk assessment and the utilization of climate scenario analysis. So they're looking at how they're going to transition to a net zero economy by 2050 or earlier, and what are those transition risks that are going to impact them. And the DMA alone will not go deep enough to identify all of those material IROs throughout your value chain without doing more full climate risk scenario analysis. Now companies are moving towards nature risk scenario analysis, or integrating nature within that. And don't forget the social aspect there, looking at environmental justice aspects that you would have, other social aspects into that. Separately, particularly in response to a lot of the kind of supply chain transparency legislation or modern slavery legislation that's come out, CSRD we've seen, it's a need to do due diligence, not only around environmental, but around social issues, particularly modern slavery. So those three will definitely be ones that we'll look to, just because of the impact, but is also the regulatory exposure. And companies will want to consider doing that after the DNA, or start integrating it in the DMA as early as they can. And it can take a while. It can take many, many months to do that, and then quantifying, monetizing those risks that you have against the different scenarios can be an expensive and long-term project. So start early.
So I think the key here is there's a lot of these exercises that are ongoing. So all of this is, you have to start at some point. This DMA, but also the risk assessments, the long processes that take time, learning, and effort, but they're really worth doing, because it gives you a much better insight into what your business is expecting. A key component, which I find one of the most interesting under CSRD, is stakeholder engagement. I would say that the legislation itself is pretty quiet on it. It does say that you need to do it. It's pretty kind of focused on how you need to do, on what you need to do. You need to engage with effective communities, and you need to engage subject matter experts to get that kind of objective insight. But there's nowhere how you need to do this. A lot of companies struggle with that. They don't really know, in terms of stakeholder engagement, how to instrument that correctly. And I think this is one of the key areas where I really see a lot of companies kind of, fall down, in that sense that there is no stakeholder engagement at all, even within the business. And I put that in brackets there. I see there's been really kind of, companies are struggling just to get cross-functional engagement with the team. We see sustainability or ESG teams just to try to churn out the DMA and the CSRD reporting as quick as possible, without really proper engagement to talk to the rest of the the departments and teams and geographies where they might have operations. So with that in mind, what are your kind of key kind of observations around stakeholder engagement, Jeff, from what you've seen so far?
Thanks. To be honest, it's commendable on what companies are doing and the steps they're changing, how quickly they're moving. But at the same time, I see so many of very comprehensive DMAs that have cost clients a lot of money to undertake. And they're really missing some of the key requirements here, as you pointed out, on engaging affected communities. They've just, in their stakeholder engagement, they didn't even use proxies per se to try to understand what the impacts might be on affected communities and what's really important to them. And that's really concerning, to be honest with you. Additionally, we are not seeing many external experts engaged and listed. And so if I'm going to be an assurer, I'm going to come and assure the process here as well as the outcomes of the DMA. I'm going to look at particularly what process, what formula, what scoring did you use, who did you engage to rank whether these issues are material or not material. And if at a high level risk, we're saying biodiversity is material and it might be in these potential parts of the value chain or these geographies, I want to see a biodiversity expert or someone with a decent amount of biodiversity expertise coming into that also may have some understanding and work on biodiversity in that region, in that supply chain. And I'm not seeing that at all. And so I'm going to look for those experts. Some companies have that expertise in-house there, some of the more mature ones, but many don't. So that's one of the things I'm going to be looking for. And I've yet to see a lot of that in there. Where it becomes a big problem is when you consider an issue that might be material for an industry, like when we look at the sector standards, and it's maybe a manufacturing industry or something, and they've come to the conclusion that water is not material for them. But that's one of the key kind of topics in the sector-based standard. I'm going to look and say, well, who did you speak with? What type of assessment did you do to determine that water is not, when all of these other companies in the same geography and industry are saying that it is material? And if I don't see a subject matter expert speaking to that with that expertise, I'm going to be concerned and look further.
And I think that is a really key point there. And that kind of brings us also in the next slide already there, is that there's objective scoring and analysis. And that's where your subject matter experts really kind of come in. The experts in a particular topical area there or geography. And the idea is that ideally, most of this, to a degree, will be subjective, but we're trying to make this whole process as objective as possible. And what we've seen often is that there's this, for a lot of companies, yes, they might have some internal expertise around subject matters, but a lot of companies lack really specific expertise on biodiversity or not area. They still then often defer to their internal specialists and say, we spoke to them, it's fine, we're good there, it's not relevant. But we really want you to understand, to go out and get that external kind of objective insight into, is water stress really an issue for us? If it is for everyone, why is it not for us? And have a short explanation or opinion from that expert there. That's what's really going to make it a lot more objective and improve the quality of that whole materiality assessment. What are some of the other things that we've seen where companies are really kind of struggling with in terms of the scoring and the thresholds is around the remediable character of a negative impact. So this is quite an interesting area there. And we spoke about that, Jeff. How would you describe kind of the struggle that companies have with that?
It's very new to many of them here. Many companies, are used to trying to at least quantify some of the financial impacts of risk, and sometimes sustainability matters come into there. But trying to understand how they're impacting different ecosystems, different social protections that might be in place, it's something they're not used to trying to gather information on. And to compound that, now they're being asked to look at that information throughout their value chain where they may not have much control over, they may not have much transparency around. And so it can be incredibly difficult there. But that's where a lot of these risks lie. And so this is one area, because the DMA process has not been prescriptive with CSRD. There's a lot of flexibility around that. They have prescribe the elements that we need to look for, and one of those being the irremediable character of impact. Practitioners are trying to understand, what is deemed by that. So the irremediable character of impact, that wording came from more of the human rights area there, and we were looking at salient human rights impacts. So as we're looking at it from an environmental perspective here, one of the examples I gave earlier is a common one is if we think that within our supply chain, they're withdrawing water, our suppliers drawing water from an aquifer, it's a water stressed area. The majority of aquifers and areas in the US, at least here, are water stressed. And we're withdrawing water at a rate that's faster than the recharge rate of the aquifer. And if it takes 1,000 years plus for an aquifer to recharge, that has a very high level of irremediability there. It's going to be very difficult for us to remediate that. So in that instance, if we have that in our supply chain, despite the scope that you may have over here, the scale or others, if you have a high level of irremediable character there, that needs to be raised as a material impact, and that from a site perspective. Similarly with human rights, if you have, your product is not harming people everywhere, but a few people have had really severe reactions or responses to your problem, maybe even died. Those are, your scale and scope may be small, but the irremediable character is huge. You can't bring anyone back to life. They've lost them. So those small instances need to not be washed out, when you're averaging and doing some of your scoring, but they need to be raised up as material information that should be disclosed.
Yeah, I think that is really a key point that's really important to think about. So that remediable character of negative impact, really think about that, really kind of, deeply, and really have a conversation with the whole team and with any experts that you might use about what does that mean for that particular impact that you're talking about? Like, what does that scale of remediability look like? And at what point? So don't kind of, go over too quickly. Get all the information you need to really inform your view on that. And yes, you might quite quickly get to a point where you say, well, this, even though the skill, the scope is not that high, but the irremediable character is really high. So this is material. We really need to focus on this. So with that, I think we're getting close to time. This is a little list of summary. There's some new things and some things we're already flagged here. So I just want to run through that with you, Jeff, in terms of what are some of the best practices that might help you, ensure that you don't fall into some of those kind of practices we've just gone over. And the first one is in terms of engaging assurance provider early. Why is that so important in this case?
Well, just with the DMA, you're going to need to have both the process and the outcomes of the DMA assured. So you'll want to make sure that, and that can take time and it can be costly. And so you'll want to, we have a very short amount of time here till you have many companies need to report. So you'll want to build time for assurance later, both of your DMA as well as your disclosures. And some of the leading firms to do assurance, might not have that availability. Also, they want to talk with what their process of assurance is going to be so that you can start preparing for that. And, you can discuss the materiality, your DMA approach, or the approach being proposed by a company early. Also, you want to make sure you're going to have the documentation for them to assure, or have it, even better yet, have a system through which they can come in and see how those decisions were made. They can be time-stamped, et cetera, et cetera. That really helps with that assurance, and that can bring the cost down.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So really, and we see insurance providers, around the world are trying to catch up and really understand this process. So if you bring them along early in that journey, it will make a big difference. It will make it easier for both of you. We spoke about the value chain. Really important to thoroughly map that, think about that, have a plan. If you're not, perfection is always hard, but if you're not perfect in year one, have a plan how to improve in year 2 and year 3, but really think about that and do that well. We spoke about those specialized risk assessments, so climate, nature, human risk, human rights risk assessment. They can help a lot. If you already have them, use them to feed into that DMA. If not, throughout that DMA process, the thinking in the DMA in identifying the risk might really trigger you to take on one of those more specialized assessments. We spoke about analyzing the interdependencies between impacts and financially material topics, which is important. Also about that transition relief and improving year over year. And we spoke about that first DMA is generally the hardest, but make sure it's a good solid foundation so you don't have to redo things. You'll just build upon that in the subsequent years. Another one on stakeholder engagement, and this is an interesting one, I think, that I'll ask you about, Jeff, is that a lot of people still think stakeholder engagement equals, we'll just do one kind of survey, a big one, send it to everyone, and we're good to go. Is that best practice? How would you think about, what's the best way to engage with stakeholders?
Definitely not best practice. And EFRAG recently released a report on a number of companies, kind of early CSRD implementation, who had reported. And one of the key findings there was how companies that are now shifting to doing the materiality assessments in accordance with CSRD here have moved away from the surveys because they're not objective. They're not necessarily evidence-based. They're still using them to some degree, and they are helpful in certain ways, but you need to move towards more focused engagement. So you're talking about certain types of potential topics or impacts, risks, and opportunities with an individual or a proxy there, or a organization that could represent some of these views that can add an objective opinion, an informed opinion about whether this is a real risk, the severity of that risk here. That's what we want to do with, and you want to be able to capture that information and then combine that with surveys and combine that with the desk research that you're doing, the on-the-ground research that you're doing. So you really want to engage very much beyond a really subjective survey that's being sent out to people that can't comment and feel uncomfortable commenting on that. Additionally, when you do the survey, you're not going to grasp a lot of the details, the nuances, those interdependencies between the risks. You can't flesh those out. A lot of times you get a low response rate on that as well.
Good insight. So yeah, that diverse mix of approaches, and really tailor it to the competency of your stakeholder. How do you engage them about what? Really important, and be objective. And I think that's what we spoke about at length throughout the webinar. Use those external subject matter experts, get that objective view into your DMA. And while you're doing all of this, make sure that you record everything, because there will be assurance. So you really want to make sure that if to that point you've excluded, water management, and the assurance provider asks you at the end, so who made that decision? Make sure that you have a clear kind of log where you've recorded that. And to be able to do that, invest in good auditable systems. So really make sure that you have something in place that captures everything, so that you're not sitting there taking notes and notes are lost. And really be systematic about this and record everything every step of the way. And then finally, build internal controls. So I think this is really important. Like we spoke about that IRO management process. How are you going to do that? Who's going to be involved in that process? But also, how are you going to integrate that with existing functions? Like, your chief risk officer, they run an ERM, the corporate level. Make sure that you don't have two separate systems that integrate all those things. So it's really about, all of this is about bringing your whole company on that journey with you. It's about embedding sustainability. As with finance, yes, the CFO might ultimately set the budget with the business and the board, but every department's got their own, departmental budget and their budget lines, and they're looking at that every month. Sustainability should be the same. Doing that DMA as well. Get everyone on board and ask them what you need. So you don't need a massive sustainability team, as long as you've got people embedded across the organization that help you do this work. That will be the key.
Great points there, Tim. One final one that we have here before we jump into questions is just, as a regulatory requirement, you can start the process, but don't see it as a compliance initiative. See it as an initiative to both de-risk your organization and to create value there. Companies are identifying enormous risks. They're able to mitigate those risks. They're able to create long-term value. They're able to identify those opportunities, put resources behind that, reduce costs. So really approach it from that perspective, and it can add a lot of value.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Jeff. Some really kind of good areas to think about in terms of those common pitfalls and best practices. So with that, I want to invite Seth back to the stage and see if there's any questions that have come in to him, if we can help answer them.
All right, that was great. Thanks so much. Tons of information that was shared with our audience. We did get a couple questions that came directly to me. Actually, one just following up on those best practices slide. So the question was, how should my company be thinking about the interlinking nature of our ERM system, the double materiality assessment?
Happy to take that if you'd like. Great question. So what I found in many companies is that a lot of the ERMs also aren't fit for purpose. So what we'll do is we'll try to take the information that exists in the ERM, some of those risks, some of those opportunities that they are managing opportunities in their ERM, and we'll take that as an input into the DMA because it's existing event. We'll also look at the thresholds. What thresholds have you set? Are they qualitative? Are they quantitative? If they are quantitative for a financial materiality risk, what are those levels there? And then are you looking at short, medium, and long term? Some companies, sadly, despite being mid-cap companies, they don't have fully fledged ERM systems in place. They might have things around health and safety here. They might have put a few things on cybersecurity there, some of the things they're dealing with, or reporting at localized sites for environmental reporting it's compliance oriented. So we'll realize that they need to actually move into a wider ERM system. Secondly, a lot of times they aren't using the same time horizons there. They're very short term. So, moving beyond that quarterly, yearly, maybe 2-3 years up there, to actually looking at medium term, where you may be out to 5 years, longer term, and especially when you get to climate change out to 2050. So there definitely needs to be, it's a good opportunity to refresh and improve, just your enterprise risk management here, your enterprise data on that.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. That's a great answer. All right. Another question we got on the topic of stakeholder engagement. Is there a general rule of thumb of how many, whether it be interviews or surveys, that a company should be conducting to achieve enough evidence towards their materiality results?
Yeah, no, I'll take this one. It's a really interesting question where companies think sometimes that more is better. So I would say in the end, think about it, it's about quality. It's about that quality engagement. It's about really getting deep insights. So it's about thinking like, who are the stakeholders that I'm impacting and the communities that I'm affecting? And how can I then really focus and have a focused engagement with the people that I affect and draw out that information about how they see that? Is this a real impact? How are they experiencing that? So it's about drawing out that qualitative information there, rather than just doing a survey to 1,000 people and then say, well, we engaged 1,000 people, and you might get a low response rate on your survey, or it's really drawing that out and thinking about who are competent stakeholders to actually go to. And sometimes you might be dealing with silent stakeholders, like nature can't speak for itself or future generations. So in those cases, you need to think about what are ways to collect that information. What are the proxies? So maybe there's research, academic papers, or other scientific information, or experts that we spoke about, subject matter experts you can go to and have a conversation with, or do that desk research and really form an opinion about that. So I think that the simple way of thinking about it, like as long as we engage a lot of people and send them a survey, or do a few quick kind of interviews with them, we tick the box of stakeholder engagement. That's the wrong kind of way of thinking about it. The real way of thinking about it is getting quality, deep insights.
That's great. That's a great answer. Thanks, Tim. All right, that wraps up our Q&A. So let's run into our final slide here. So thanks so much, Jeff, for joining us today. You provided so many thoughtful and important insights for our audience. Again, thanks, Tim. For everybody out in the audience, a couple things to note. One, please subscribe to our newsletter. If you're not on our newsletter, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're not already subscribed to that, again, we have loads of different content and information. And if you are out there and you're just starting your journey, or you do have to comply with regulations like the CSRD, please reach out to us, both for any information that we can enter, any questions that you have, or particularly if you are looking to run a double materiality assessment, whether it's CSRD aligned or you have to run more of a standard approach. Socialsuite's here and has a number of solutions to help you in market. My email address is right here on the left. So is Tim's. And again, thank you so much for the time and listening to today's webinar, and hope to see you soon on the next one. Thank you.